Hey there, Andrew Anderson here. In today's interview, I'm interviewing Ivor Cummings, the Fat Emperor, and he is one of the leading experts, I would say top 10 in the world, on getting the word out about low carb diets and the impact of high carb diets on your heart health and on a whole host of other things, including diabetes. And he is one of the champions for the calcification test, which you may have not ever heard before, that can actually, it is the most predictable way to find out if you could have a possible heart attack or a stroke. And he's involved with an organization that is helping let people know about this all around the world. And today we're going to talk about some of the scientific information involved in this. And if you are into sciencey stuff, then this is going to be for you. And even if you're not, we're going to talk about some of the simple reasons why you really want to consider doing keto and intermittent fasting. It's absolutely amazing. So without further ado, let's get going and see you on the inside. So today we have Ivor Cummings, as in the diesel engine here. He's one of the probably 10 guys that I actually respect as far as what's going on in the keto world and IF. A little bit, and we're also going to talk about cholesterol, low carbohydrates, and anything else he wants to throw in there. So thanks for stopping by, Ivor.
Hey, thanks a lot, Andrew. It's great to be here.
And so I'm just going to kind of give you, you're the expert here today, and I'm just, I'm constantly learning here. So wherever you want to take this, I know it's going to be beneficial to, all of the members of the Facebook group. I think we're up to like 78,000 now. So, and I'm sure we'll get more YouTube views than that. But why don't you start off wherever you want to start off with?
Yeah, great, Andrew. Well, I thought about this morning, and I thought this recent research I think now put into context when cholesterol maybe rises a little when you go low carb or keto. And not to say that's certainly not a problem, but just give people some more context around that and other things that may be much more important when going to low carb or keto. So I was going to run through slides for maybe, I don't know, maybe 25 minutes and just give people a feel for how it works and hopefully help them.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. And I forgot to mention that Ivor is also the author of Eat Rich and Live Long, along with Dr. Jeffrey Gerber. I've got the book. It's kind of mind-blowing, and if you don't buy it for anything else other than the recipes, that's worth it. But like every page, I learned something new. And page 250. Maybe we can dive into it, or 230 rather, kind of blew me away and brought everything together, which is why I like you, because you can explain sciencey things into so that I can understand them, which basically a third grader. So we're good to go.
Great stuff, Andrew. Well, okay, I'll roll ahead. So showing on the screen now is the cholesterol conundrum talk I gave after my first year of research back in, I think, 13. And I went through all the mechanisms of how LDL is made by the liver, essentially, and how most of your cholesterol in your body comes from your liver, not from the cholesterol you eat. But today I'll skip through that, but people can look that up on my YouTube channel or Google cholesterol conundrum, and it'll explain all how the basic old-style cholesterol works. But today I'm going to go into a little more about the particle counts, the advanced cholesterol tests that are now more and more coming to the fore. So just on the old LDL-C, the classic LDL you got in your panel, just to remind people that, it's a very poor predictor of cardiovascular issues. It's not irrelevant, but it's very weak, and the top lipidologists would largely acknowledge that. So I'll show a recent 2015 study here. And as we can see, with 103,000 men and women tracked for 8 years, middle-aged, the people with the lower LDL versus the very high LDL, there was nearly no difference in the rate of heart disease seen. And this is a common finding in middle-aged people. But what's interesting is the low triglyceride over HDL versus the high triglyceride over HDL people, there was a very big difference seen, with the high trig over HDL ratio being much higher heart disease. nearly 19% versus 9. So the reason for this is that triglyceride over HDL is a good proxy or a marker for insulin resistance or high insulin, high glucose. And that's why it's a great predictor, because it really measures one of the biggest causes of heart disease. So that's a huge study. And I'll show another one from China, and there are many of these. And in the second one, you can see where they carefully measured the LDL in a large group with an 8-year follow-up looking for coronary heart disease events. You can see the low LDL people versus the high LDL, very high LDL people in group A. There's no real difference in heart disease in the following 8 years. But group B over here, they have a much higher heart disease rate, but again, whether they're low LDL or high LDL made no difference. So people might be interested, well, what's the difference with group B then, that they have a much higher heart disease rate? And the difference is that group B are a high total cholesterol over HDL ratio, right? So in this study, it broke out LDL and it showed, like many others do, that the classic LDL is a very weak predictor and nearly becomes irrelevant when you look at the ratios. They hold the power. And the director of Framingham said this 30 years ago in a published paper. He said the ratios are really powerful. LDL on its own is very weak. So just to hammer the point home and be straight up about it, the 5 of the world's current top risk calculators from all over the world, if you put in a middle-aged guy, 50 years of age, with a total cholesterol of 300 and a HDL good cholesterol of 80, that person by definition has an LDL up near 200 milligrams, right? Even though the calculators don't take the LDL, would you believe?
Right.
But you put this guy in and you get a low risk in all the world's calculators, even though he has a super high LDL. And the reason is it's the ratios of cholesterol to HDL that really decide the risk. And the calcification scan is the ultimate measure of risk, but we'll come back to that at the end. So the key predictors of mortality showing on the screen now, I put these together in 13 and they haven't really changed. So it's bad lipoprotein ratios or advanced lipid ratios like ApoB over ApoA1, high serum triglyceride levels or more VLDL, and small dense LDL and high particle counts of LDL in the advanced test. These are good measures of risk, mostly because they speak to hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance. And then I've listed insulin levels, obviously directly measured, blood glucose and HbA1c, and hypertension or high blood pressure, most of which is related to insulin resistance also. And we've got liver markers and homocysteine. So we've got all these great measures of risk that speak to root cause. But we can't really put LDL old style on this list because it's too weak. Now, we'll talk a little about the LDL particle count, and I'm just going to be clear here. The old LDL-C in the old panels that everyone got, that's the concentration of cholesterol in all of the LDL particles. But the new risk factor in the advanced testing is the count of the particles themselves or their size. So it's much more focused on the quality of your cholesterol particles, your lipoproteins, rather than just how much cholesterol is in them. So it's a much better risk measure. So I'm showing here an artery, which I drew myself, apologies for the drawing. And you can see the artery wall on each side, and you can see the blood flowing, red blood cells in the lumen or down the center of the pipe. And we've shown the purple LDL particles there. And the classic LDL theory that's accepted all over the world is that if you have more particles, more will get into your wall, just diffuse in there, and more will get trapped and damaged and cause inflammation in the wall. And that is the cholesterol theory of atherosclerosis or vascular disease that leads to heart attacks. So that's fine. And I'll just show now a simplified version. Here we have the LDLs in your blood, and we have the wall of your artery down at the bottom, and there's a kind of a barrier layer to the wall of your artery to stop things getting in there that should not. But the key point is there's 5 layers of crucial technology that will allow or not allow the particles of LDL to be a problem. So you can't just look at the number if it moves up or down. You have to look at the big picture, and most of the picture is not just the LDL particle count, okay? So I'll show you the first layer, 0, that's important in whether a high number of particles is a problem or not. And this is oxidized LDL. So there is a lot of evidence that standard undamaged LDL particles are actually quite okay in any circumstances, whereas oxidized LDLs that are damaged in your blood by your lifestyle, what you eat, or inflammatory conditions, that the oxidized LDLs are the major problem more than ordinary ones. So that's layer 0. Layer 1 is the GLYCOCALYX, and this is an exotic hair-like structure that grows on the inside wall of your artery, and it has a sieving effect. It manages how LDL particles and other inflammatory components actually can access the wall of your artery and interact with it. So the GLYCOCALYX is really important, and it's a new technology being understood now.
Yeah, can I ask you a question on this? When I saw you did an interview or a video on the glycocalyx, that I had never seen that before. So you said it's fairly new.
It is new in the sense that LDL has been around forever. The GLYCOCALYX was first recognized around 30 years ago, and it's so fine and so delicate that if you cut out some artery and you try and analyze it, the glycocalyx is gone. So they didn't discover it for a long time because it disappears as soon as you interfere. But then they developed methods to actually visualize it without destroying it. And they used electron microscopes under special conditions to see it. So it's relatively new, and I did not hear it talked about in the whole world of heart disease until very recently. So I went and dug for the scientific papers from the people who have studied this, and wow, it is fascinating.
Yeah, it blew me away because basically, as I understand it, and stop me if I'm incorrect here, if your glycocalyx is not healthy, your arteries aren't going to be healthy.
Essentially, yes.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, it's got crucial functions. I always use the phrase, evolution is not an idiot. And evolution, or intelligent being or whatever. I won't get into religion here, but this was developed, and it's an amazingly exotic structure. And to give an idea, these tiny hairs on the inner wall of your artery, it's critical they are there and healthy, because when the blood flows, there's an effect that the hairs actually become mechanosensors, and they trigger the inner wall of the artery to release nitric oxide and to do many other things based on them sensing the blood flow. So that's just one thing they do. They also have a sieving effect. They also gather together certain molecules that are required to deal with damage to the arterial wall. So this little hairy, and it's tiny, it's around 200 nanometers, which is just really small.
Right.
But it does all of these different functions. And I'll talk about it a little more in a minute when I go into that section. But
I didn't want to interrupt you, but that's what it was like a rock hitting me between the eyeballs when I saw what you explained before and the function of this. So looked great.
Yeah, no, it fascinated me. Now I ate and drank the papers for a couple of weeks on this. So, but that's just layer 1 of 5. So oxidized LDL, whether your glycocalyx is functional or not. Then we've got the endothelial cell, a single cell layer on the inside wall of your artery, and this manages what goes in and out as well. And it can transport LDL across from your blood into your arterial wall. This is all designed in evolution as well. And LDL can leak through between the cells into your artery wall. So the health of this endothelial layer is hugely important as to whether your LDLs can become a problem or not. Layer 3 is the proteoglycans. And these are little structures kind of like the glycocalyx hairs, and they can trap LDL particles inside the wall. And there they can get oxidized further and damaged, and they can set off inflammatory reactions. So whether or not your LDL particles are the type that will get caught here is another layer of importance as to whether the LDL is a problem for you. And finally, there's layer 4, that LDL or cholesterol that does end up in here, whether brought in by the body for purposes or whether it sneaks in. HDL, your good cholesterol, is a crucial role of that is to mop up any leftover cholesterol that's in the wall and simply transport it back out. And this is a known, proven function of your HDL. But guess what? If your HDL is not performing properly or it's in any way damaged or compromised, well, then you're going to get more LDL building up where it usually would be taken away and dealt with so there's no issue. So this layer 4 HDL efflux, it's called. Efflux meaning it takes cholesterol out and brings it back to the liver. That's hugely important too. So basically 5 layers of crucial technology to decide whether your LDLs may be a problem or not, and they don't get talked about. Usually it's just the number of LDLs is higher, therefore there's probably a problem. Let's go. So I'll go into each one now in a little more detail, nothing too heavy though. I'm not going to go through graphs and papers. So layer 0, the oxidized LDL as part of the cause. And here we show a diagram. With the top left, we have oxidized LDL shown bright orange. And we see the LOX1 receptor on your endothelial cells on the inner wall of your artery. And there's a great paper around this, and many papers actually. And this one suggests that the oxidized LDL that gets damaged in your plasma by high glucose, high insulin, high ages or advanced glycation end products from diabetes or high sugar, and many, many other effects, smoking, a whole range of conditions can damage your LDL particles. But this paper suggested that the oxidized LDL in your blood is what goes in and causes trouble in the wall. And it specifically gave evidence that the native or undamaged LDLs are not really part of this atherosclerosis process. So interestingly, the science is emerging now that this oxidized LDL may be really important, and undamaged native LDL, even in large numbers, may not have too much of a function in driving the disease. And I'm going to put this target list now for people who are viewing. I've put a list of things that would drive oxidized LDL, and I've put a target sign on it. And I want you to remember this for the next 10 or 15 minutes. So hyperinsulinemia, diabetic physiology, high blood glucose and spikes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, which is an absolute epidemic in the world, oxidative stress, many other inflammatory drivers and conditions, smoking, and all of these things drive oxidized LDL. And these things I listed, I'd look at as root causes that really drive the problems. Okay?
Yep. Can I ask you one question here,
Yeah.
Ivor? On that, in a lot of people weren't familiar with it, and you had it in your book that just a couple years ago, at least from the American standpoint, that the majority of Americans were pre-diabetic or hyperinsulinemia. Was that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just quote now the latest Center of Disease Control, CDC figures. I have a report.
Awesome.
64% of over 45s are now pre-diabetic or diabetic based on glucose measures. So we've got 2/3 nearly of over 45s are essentially diabetic in America. And if you measured their insulin and measured more accurately, you'd find the figure is quite a lot higher,
Right.
I would say. Another recent figure is that using the various measures of metabolic health, 88% of adult Americans are now declared as not having optimal metabolic health. Only 12% have no metabolic syndrome and no apparent issue.
Wow.
So go figure, right, as to what's driving most of the disease. In Europe, the figures are not as bad in Europe, and we don't have as good figures here. But it is an interesting thing that in a recent study across 25 countries in Europe of heart disease patients from ages 18 to 80, when they looked at them all closely, over 70% of heart disease afflicted had essential diabetes by glucose measures, and they didn't measure insulin, which would account for quite a few more.
And would you suggest, I know in the book that they do the Kraft measurement or the short version of that?
Well, yeah, the simple measure for looking for diabetic issues is a fasting glucose and a fasting insulin, and you can go online and do a HOMA, a HOMA calculation, and that's the easy way. You should be below 1, ideally, whereas most people would be above 1.
Right.
The more advanced test is from Dr. Kraft, who did 15,000 people, and he did 5 hours after drinking 75 grams of glucose solution. You measure your glucose and your insulin for the next several hours. The simple version of Kraft's advanced test I just described is to drink 75 grams glucose solution and 2 hours later get a single insulin measurement. And if that's above 40, you're very likely going to fail the Kraft test. And if it's below 30, you're very likely non-diabetic, healthy.
Thanks. Yeah, that's I read that in your book too, and that's kind of why isn't that being done though? I mean, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but why isn't that test being done everywhere if it's as accurate as you've just showed us here?
Yeah, well, it's an amazing test. And a Chinese team, I have another paper from a few years ago, and they found that people who had bad patterns had up to 50% full-blown diabetes 11 years later. And the people with the good pattern, only 3% had full-blown diabetes. So it's an
Wow.
amazing predictive test. Uh, the problem is that the diabetes medical industry and all the experts for 50 years have always viewed type 2 diabetes as a glucose related condition, high blood glucose. And they simply were unwilling to listen to Kraft and to accept that it's really an insulin disease and you have to measure insulin to properly diagnose. And they just want to stick with the way it's always been. Measure the blood glucose. If it ain't really high, you're not diabetic. But we know that that's complete rubbish. If your insulin is high, even if your glucose is fine, you're diabetic, period. And the damage of diabetes will be occurring with hyperinsulin before the blood glucose shows you up as being diabetic. You might be 10, 15 years late using blood glucose, and by then you might have had your heart attack from your diabetes anyway. You might not even be around anymore.
Right.
So,
Do you see that switching around though? I mean, it's such an obvious, and if you're just looking at the statistics, you would think they would switch over, but do you think it's just because they're so entrenched they don't want to accept it, or?
yeah, they're just entrenched. Insulin was a tricky measurement to do decades ago, and that was one of the problems. It was easy to measure glucose and cholesterol and things. I think it's too big a shift now to acknowledge that high insulin is the problem. Insulin is a huge market. It's a mixed message to say you're type 2 diabetic because your insulin's too high. And you know what? We're going to give you more insulin because your pancreas can't produce enough. So we're going to horse some more in there, as we say in Ireland.
Yeah.
There's a lot of political and professional challenges around just acknowledging what diabetes really is. But I think it's changing. And I spoke and debated at an Irish National Institute of Preventative Cardiology last November. And the results I mentioned from the European study are coming out now, and it's beginning to get into the mainstream just how many people with heart disease are actually diabetic. And it's beginning to be discussed because the cost of this is enormous in personal loss, tragedy, and financially now. It's a massive burden on the economy.
Yep. I mean, we're talking, tens of millions of people that are needlessly, having ill health, dying, or I don't want to get off on a tangent, but it's huge. Plus the monetary cost too. Like you said, it'll if it keeps on going, it's going to bankrupt virtually every country in the out there.
Oh yeah, I mean Brazil, China, the emerging economies, they're exploding with diabetes. India is, I mean, the amputations in India from diabetes in the last 20 years have just gone through the roof. It's unprecedented. It's an absolute catastrophe. Yeah. Now, of course, I'll mention shortly, but if people really want to know what their level of heart disease is and their real risk right now, you really need to do a calcification scan, which sees the heart disease inside your heart. And it's not like an indirect blood measure. It's vastly more powerful. So I work for Irish Heart Disease Awareness, a charity set up by Irish entrepreneur David Bobbitt. And we're working to let people understand how they really find out their heart disease. But sure, we can do a lot better with the blood test too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll put a link up for that so people can find that easily too, because it's I had a relative of mine that went in for that, and they had a relatively clean bill of health until the results from that came in.
Yeah, I mean that can be a real wake-up call for millions of people who their docs think their bloods look okay and they've enormous heart disease and massive risk. Or indeed, you could have people whose bloods might look bad to a doctor, but they've a zero calcification and very low disease, and that may help them maybe decide on medications or not. So this is all emerging now. This calcification is in the 2018 AHA ACC guidelines. And it's really blowing up in 18 because they're acknowledging this is an amazing test and it can help in middle risk people to decide whether you have disease or not, way beyond the risk calculators. So things are changing.
Great, glad to hear it.
Excellent. So we were there on oxidized LDL, and that's just the first of 5. But again, this target list I'm showing on the screen is not exhaustive. It's not everything, but all of these things we're going to keep seeing are the things that would tend to drive oxidized LDL, right? So now the GLYCOCALYX, we'll talk in it a little more detail. So here's a picture, and you can see, 200 nanometer, which is a fifth of a micrometer. I can't remember in inches, but it's tiny, right?
Yeah.
It's super tiny. So actually a hair is 40 micrometers, and this is only 1/5 of a micrometer. So it would be 200 times smaller than the width of a human hair. So that'll give it some perspective. So here's a paper people might want to look up. Arterial glycocalyx dysfunction is the first step in the atherothrombotic process. And it was one of the first papers I got. And they made the case that it's actually the first step. It's not LDL particles. It's not inflammatory molecules. Its damage to this glycocalyx is actually the initiating step, right? So that's interesting. So I'll show here a little more detail, the glycocalyx, and it's shown here where my mouse pointer is, but there's a boundary layer outside it that gives further cushioning of the inner wall of your artery. And there's lots of functions, but one is to actually keep the LDLs from not accessing the endothelium too much, and also to keep other very active physiological inflammatory molecules and immune cells from getting too interacting with the arterial wall unless they're needed. So there's a healthy one on the left. And on the right, we see a disrupted glycocalyx. So damaged, disrupted, gaps. And here's where you can get excessive ingress of LDL and also molecules reaching the wall that should not usually do so. So this is a bad thing.
So that's basically your plaque buildup. Is that correct?
Well, it's the initial steps of
Gotcha.
plaque. So just in a quick succession, when you have a problem with your arterial wall inner layer, glycocalyx, any damage, you then have ingress of LDL, you have inflammatory molecules, you have an inflammatory reaction, and then that leads on to more LDL in the wall, more inflammation, and it goes on until you develop more and more atherosclerosis and these plaque or pustules. So it's a multi-step process, but this would be an early step, shall we say, would be proposed.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So this study I pulled out, there's many studies. I'm only going to show a quick one. And these guys, it's actually 1984, so it's around 30 years ago in the early days. And they didn't really know about the glycocalyx fully, but they knew there was a structure there on the arterial wall. So they built in a petri dish in a laboratory an endothelium cell layer, like the inner wall of your artery. And they tried to damage this layer of glycocalyx, these sugar-type molecules. So what they did is they got the control cells and they were not damaged, and they saw that the LDL going into the endothelial cells, internalizing, was very low. But then they damaged this layer using neuraminidase, and they saw that 10 times more LDL particles went in and engaged with the endothelial cells. And when they used ferritin, which is very damaging, and they verified the glycocalyx was completely damaged down to 5% of its previous thickness, they saw huge amounts of LDL would now go into the endothelial cells. So they demonstrated, wow, when we damage this layer, way more LDL gets involved with the cells. Okay, so it kind of illustrates the principle. And the things, without going through all the studies I've been through, but the things that would damage the glycocalyx from the studies I do have, high sugar spikes, so obviously standard American diets, especially when everyone's diabetic,
Yep.
hypertension shown to damage the glycocalyx, oxidative stress, oxidized LDLs, but not native undamaged LDLs. Oxidized LDLs in the plasma can damage glycocalyx, smoking, and here's one you might like, Andrew, arterial morphology. Sounds like a big word, but basically they've realized for decades that atherosclerosis and these plaque do not occur spread throughout your arteries. What happens is you can have a massive plaque that could kill you in one side of your artery in one point, and the artery all around it, there's no plaque, and it's perfect. So the question has always been, why is there focal atherosclerosis, or why does it occur in special spots with none of it nearby? And one reason put forward now is that's where the glycocalyx is thinned or damaged. So at the forks in arteries, you get atherosclerosis right at the fork. And they're now verifying that the glycocalyx is much thinner and narrower at the forks, and it's not nearly as robust. So there's great papers on this, and it will explain possibly why atherosclerosis occurs at certain points and not others. It's because the glycocalyx is much thinner there. It's compromised.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, it makes complete engineering sense. And it's just great to see the studies coming out now around this. So really important. But now I'll bring in my target list again because, yep, the things that will tend to damage glycocalyx are the same list of the bigger causes of heart disease. And I won't read them all out, but it's hyperinsulinemia, glucose spikes, metabolic syndrome, oxidative stress, all the stuff we know we can address with diet and lifestyle contributes to damaging the glycocalyx.
Awesome.
Yeah. So layer 2, and people are probably thinking, when will this end? But only 5 layers. So layer 2 is the endothelium. And just to remind people, this is the single cell layer on the very inside wall of your artery, under the glycocalyx. And it's the barrier to the inner wall of your artery. It faces the blood. The glycocalyx protects it, but the endothelium layer I'm talking about, that protects the wall. So let's take a look. So here we have papers where they show that transcytosis happens in the endothelial cells. In other words, the LDLs in your blood can get brought in by these endothelial cells, brought across the cell, complete, unaffected, and popped out on the other side, inside your artery wall. And this process has been demonstrated. So again, evolution has designed a complex process to take LDL from your blood and bring it into the wall. So that can give people an idea that it's not just a willy-nilly leakage. You know, it's a designed process. But the papers I have that show you get higher amounts of LDL coming through these cells into your wall is when you have higher C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker, higher oxidized LDL in your plasma, high oxidant induction or oxidized state, right, from eating the wrong things or smoking or all these bad things. And then tumor necrosis factor alpha, which goes up in diabetics and obese people. It's an inflammatory marker that takes part in inflammatory reactions. And finally, I'll just mention lipopolysaccharide ingress. So when you have leaky gut from a bad diet or other problems, lipopolysaccharides get from bacteria through your gut lining into your blood, and they cause an immune reaction. So lipopolysaccharide from leaky gut has been shown to drive up this process of driving your LDL particles into your wall. So all of these are really important too, and whether or not your LDL particles are a problem or not.
Yeah, I had not heard that one before. Leaky gut equals bad arteries.
Yeah, and again, this is pretty new studies coming out. I think I got these ones from Gudmundur in Iceland. He's a doctor who does a lot of research. I think I give him credit for that paper. But yeah, fascinating. So leaky gut, basically proteins and elements that should not really get into your system. When you have leaky gut, a lot of stuff gets across that shouldn't. And when you trigger an immune reaction, the inflammatory immune cascade that occurs can in turn damage a lot of your own body's tissues. It's not your body's fault. A good example is celiac disease. So the wheat damages the villi in your gut, destroys your gut lining, and those people get massive problems because proteins and other things that should not come into their blood are now getting in. So that's where a lot of their disease comes from. Yeah. So to cap and finish on endothelium, I'm putting my target list again. You guessed it. The things that will drive damage to the endothelium or drive more transport of particles across it are the usual list of hyperinsulinemia all the way through to oxidative stress, inflammatory drivers, and all the other things I call root causes. They're real root causes. And I'll be quick here, but there's another one. Between the endothelial cells, you can leak LDL particles. And this is called paracellular transport. And it's just where the LDL particles leak through between the cells. Now, this shouldn't happen too much because there's tight junctions between your endothelial cells to control any leakage, and they're very exotic and complex. But the problem is there are many things that damage the endothelial cells, cause a lot of cell death and turnover, and this results in the much greater transport of LDL into your arterial wall. And again, a few papers I have that they've demonstrated what causes extra leakage: TNF alpha, angiotensin 2, which is related to hypertension, high blood pressure, and interleukin 17 relating to inflammatory problems. Yet again, we hear. And any insult to endothelial cells will drive up cell turnover and death and will allow a lot more porosity for LDL to come into your wall. So here we have yet another thing that will decide whether your LDL particle count may be a problem or not. And yet again, I'm showing my target list here. The kinds of root causes that drive this also are our usual list. So layer 3, the proteoglycans. And these are the structures inside the wall that can trap LDL particles that have come in from your blood. And then they can become damaged and can be part of the atherosclerosis process. So what we'd have to watch out for here is not to have LDL reactivity with these structures and binding, excessive binding, okay? Because that would cause LDL to be more of a problem than otherwise. But the papers I have which cause this to be more of an issue and bind more LDLs and cause more of a problem with your LDL, well, it's been demonstrated in blood from heart attack patients, blood from insulin-resistant people, blood from type 2 diabetics, people with small, dense, oxidized LDL. Those kinds of LDLs have a higher affinity to get caught in here. And they even had an experiment with type 1 diabetic mice because they wanted to see, well, if you have diabetes type 1, and we know the mice that do have much higher vascular damage, they wondered, was it due to more trapment here? And they found out that the diabetic mice had 8 times more retention of LDL particles down in the proteoglycans than control healthy mice, even though they had the same LDL levels as the other mice. So it was the other factors in their blood that made the LDL get caught. It wasn't the LDL itself, unless it was damaged or whatever.
Right. So this would go towards why the diabetics have such circulatory problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. They have enormous vascular issues because they have hyperglycemia. Even the type 1 diabetics that are low insulin, because they have to take insulin over their lifetime, exogenous injected in, they actually, if they eat quite a bit of carb and they inject a lot of insulin to manage it, over time, those insulin injections will cause them to become insulin resistant, like a type 2 diabetic. So they'll actually end up high insulin resistant people over their lifetime. And yes, their blood is going to have all of the problematic components from that, and they will suffer the heart disease. Unless they go low carb or keto, drop their insulin requirements hugely, and then they can live, I would say, just as long as anyone else.
Great.
Yeah. Like Dr. Bernstein is 83 and he's still doing YouTube lectures, and he's type 1 diabetic for 60 years. I mean, he's essentially proved it on his own. So I'm just going to drop in there, Andrew, the same list from earlier for people who are watching. It's the same kind of root causes that also will lead to a scenario where you'll have excessive trapping and will decide whether or not your LDL particles are a problem yet again. And the final layer, HDL efflux issues, and this is a really important one because we hear in the media, oh, lowering HDL or increasing HDL doesn't help. Well, no, the drugs don't help the HDL become more functional. So driving up HDL with drugs is worthless, and I'll show you why now.
Okay, can you what's efflux mean for the common folks out there?
Good point. Efflux is the ability of the HDL to do one of its most critical functions, which is to efflux or remove or transport cholesterol out of your arterial wall naturally and bring it back to the liver for processing. So, yeah, all of us must have a proper HDL efflux capacity, they call it, or our HDL has to be healthy and functional. And to keep your HDL healthy, well, we'll look in a minute what you do to keep it healthy. And first we look at what happens when it's not.
Right. Well, one of the other things too, I guess I meant to do this when we were first starting this, cholesterol in and of itself, we need it to live. It's not a bad thing in and of itself.
Yeah, cholesterol is arguably the most important molecule in our body. All of our cells, with some exceptions, can make their own cholesterol. It's that important. 25% of your body's cholesterol is in your brain, even though your brain is only 4% of your body weight. So cholesterol is just crucial for everything, to make your hormones, to make cell membranes. Cholesterol is beyond vital. There's no life without cholesterol. And really this whole anti-cholesterol thing is because the lipoproteins, the LDL particles that carry the cholesterol around your body everywhere, when they become damaged or dysfunctional or oxidized, then they become part of the problem of atherosclerosis. But the cholesterol, of course, is the most important molecule for health nearly that we have.
Right. But you wouldn't know it by what you read, though. I mean, it's always just given a blanket statement, cholesterol's bad, you got to get rid of it, end of story.
Well, yeah, Andrew, I mean, all the best propaganda is kept simple. So simplistic, the simplistic cholesterol is bad message works, and it makes the system run smoothly. If you start explaining what we're talking about today, everyone's going to be confused. The doctors will have to say, you mean there's LDL when it's high can be okay, or sometimes it's not. How will I know? You mean LDL could be low and the guy could still be about to have a heart attack and with massive disease progressing? How will I know? It gets complicated.
And so people tune out, unfortunately, but, complicated sometimes equals the truth and simple equals the falsehoods,
Absolutely. And there's so much of this in biochemistry, metabolism, and in the modern medical world. It's just not funny. But hopefully, well, today and other people are also trying to explain this. So hopefully over time with the internet and sharing, more and more people will get to know.
Right.
So the last one, so HDL. So HDL, as I said, it's part of human process that LDL will end up in your artery to some extent. Now, I've gone through a load of things that will make it become a much bigger problem or might not be a problem at all. But the final one is HDL removes cholesterol. And if you don't overload your HDL, and if your HDL is healthy, it will do the job and there won't be a problem in principle. But what if you damage your HDL functionality, its ability to do the efflux? Now you have a problem. So let's look at that. And this paper is fantastic. I really loved it because they did some amazing lab work for the first time in history. And what they did was they basically had a big database of people and they took all their blood and they actually found a way in a test tube to measure how good each person's HDL was at doing this removal from the atherosclerotic plaque. So one person could maybe have a 9 out of 10. The HDL was really good, worked really well, took out, I don't know, 50 units of cholesterol. And another person in the same test tube might only take out 11 units of cholesterol. In other words, their HDL was really bad. Okay, so that's what they did. They measured everyone's efflux capacity, they called it. How good was their HDL? And what they found, because they had the future heart attack history or the future event rate for all of the group, so they were able to tie the health of the HDL particles to whether or not a person had a heart attack. And what they saw was that if you had a higher HDL, and we know a higher HDL measure generally means you're in better health. Well, they saw a 35% reduction in the likelihood of a future heart attack if you had a high HDL. And that's been seen elsewhere. We know that. But then they took the measurements of how healthy the HDL was for each person. And they saw that having a healthier HDL with better efflux capacity had a 55% reduction in future heart attack rates, if that was good. And then they corrected for confounders. They just did better math to get a more truthful answer. Mm-hmm. And they saw actually that there was a 70% reduction of future heart attacks if you were in the higher HDL efflux capacity. So the health of your HDL was really, really important. I mean, hugely important. And interestingly, for strokes, the people with the high, healthy HDL particles, they had 90% lower stroke events in the following, I think it was 10 years.
Wow.
So you can see here that it's the health of the HDL particles, which we'll talk in a minute how you keep them healthy, that really makes the difference in protecting you from heart disease.
Good.
Oh, go ahead, no.
The question is, okay, by immediately seeing this, anybody that's got any common sense can say, okay, I can reduce my possibility of a stroke by 90%, my ability to have a heart attack, at least future pacing and out there, by 70%. Is there an easy test for this that's available today?
Good question. Not the one that these guys are doing. This is exotic and one-off. But the best thing you can do is get the advanced lipoprotein test, and it will show the HDL particle size distribution, and it will give an analysis to pretty much say how healthy your HDL is by indirectly measuring the size and distribution of sizes of the particles. It will take a good shot at it. A lot better than just measuring your classic HDL.
Great.
Yeah. So, and that's those advanced tests. they predict how healthy you are based on things like that. So yes, Andrew, it's kind of out there already in the advanced tests. Yeah. So that's HDL, crucial, but you will hear a lot of people saying HDL is not important. And the reason is there's no drug for it, and increasing it with drugs hasn't done anything. And the reason is the drugs just shoved it up with a chemical cattle prod. The drugs never made the HDL more functional. And we can see here that, of course, they're not going to work unless they made the HDL better, but no drugs have. So that's it. You'll hear bad press on HDL for that reason. So what would cause your HDL efflux capacity generally to be poor and rack up your risk of having an LDL problem? Well, it's our same target list, pretty much in the literature. If you get hyperinsulinemic metabolic syndrome, your HDL goes down, its functionality goes down, the size distribution in the test I mentioned goes down or goes bad. Hypertension, oxidative stress, inflammatory drivers, all of these insults are immune activating problems, and inflammatory conditions will take a toll on HDL. So then you will suffer. So it's layer 4. So we have 5 layers here, all of which are really important in deciding whether or not a higher or lower count makes a difference. And they're not being talked about. Largely, they're not. It's just the LDL number that overwhelmingly everyone focuses on. And in engineering world, we basically say, so the LDL number is a factor in a multi-factor problem. And we have 5 more factors that are hugely important. So by not looking at them, you're looking at best 1/6 of the problem. Right? So how's that going to work for you?
That's nuts. It won't. There's no possible way that it can.
Well, in fairness, if you don't want to look at all the other things and make sure they're working, yes, you could lower the number, and it does work. So if you take medication to lower the number and you have problems in your system, lowering the number will lower the problem to an extent. But it's not the way you should fix the problem. I mean, ideally. So that's what this is about, is looking at the big picture and seeing the wood for the trees. And just to illustrate, you could have a high LDL particle count person who is genuinely unhealthy and is heading for heart attack, and the risk marker is working and telling you that. But this person could have quite a lot of oxidized LDL, and we know that people with heart attacks have a ton more oxidized LDL than healthy people, and their layers could all be compromised. Therefore, they end up with a lot of LDL down here in the arterial wall, driving inflammation, and their HDL is screwed as well, so they can't even hope to manage to efflux it, and those are high-risk patients which will benefit from medications. Absolutely. But the problem is we also have a person here with the same particle number that technically will look to someone who doesn't understand this as the same high risk. But that person could have no oxidized LDL, and the layers could all be working great, and the HDL could be hyperfunctional, and they will have no issue in their arterial wall. But if you just look up at the cholesterol myopically, you're going to completely confuse yourself. So I think it behooves us to understand the full picture and to put the particle count of LDL in context. Not to say that LDL doesn't matter. If your LDL jumps up on a new diet, damn right you have to look really closely and make sure that that's not going to be an issue for you. You don't ignore any good risk marker. But what frustrates me is not putting it in context, like we've described today, gives the big picture, so you can watch your LDL number carefully and make sure that it does not indicate a high risk for you. And each person has to do it for themselves. And the other thing is, if your LDL goes up really high, say in a keto or really low carb diet, this may be okay or may not, depending on what's going on in your body. And you can do diet tweaks to bring it back down in order to be more comfortable. And that's okay too. You know, there's fairly simple diet tweaks to switch to more fish, avocado, and, you know, maybe some more complex carbs and more vegetables and things. You know, you can tweak your LDL up and down if you're uncomfortable, for sure.
Got it. And so, with are you going to do anything else more on
I,
GLYCOCALYX? Because I got a specific question on that for you.
well, I tell you what we'll do. We might finish off just another minute or two, and then we'll come back and kick around some stuff. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. So we'll wrap it up.
Good
So,
stuff. Good stuff.
right. Thanks, Andrew. So here we have our target list. These are the big things. They're not the only things. If you have lupus, you'll have massive atherosclerosis. If you have other inflammatory conditions, and many other heavy metal contamination, or if you're ApoE4 and you've damaged your metabolism, ApoE4 is a genotype you can find out on 23andMe. But those guys, if they've got diabetic from eating seed oils and sugars and carbs, and now their machine is damaged, they can be sensitive to animal fat and protein. It can pop up their insulin and their small dense particles. So, you know, there's all many kinds of scenarios you got to be careful of. But generally, what I show on the screen now, the list of target things are the ones to make sure are right. And to give an idea, Verta and many others have shown recently, if you take someone with these kinds of problems on our target list and you give them a low-carb keto diet with healthy fats, you dramatically improve all of these root causes. You know, it's been demonstrated. And that's why we do low-carb keto if we're worried about the 5 layers. And what about low-fat diets, high-carb diets? Well, all they do sometimes is lower LDL, which is one thing. They don't really do anything on our target list. They don't help at all, right? However, Professor Volek and many others have shown that a low-carb or keto diet with healthy fats can actually address all of the really important markers that we've talked about: insulin, glucose, the advanced lipoproteins, the insulin sensitivity, and a myriad inflammatory markers. So this graph, I think, from Volek just really shows why low-carb keto is a no-brainer, because it addresses the no-brainer key things that we need to help our 5 layers that we just discussed.
Yeah.
And to finish off, I've got the list of risk factors again. We've gone through ApoB now and explained that it could be an issue or not, depending on loads more important stuff. But if people are worried, and even if they're not worried, if you're a middle-risk, middle-aged person, the blood tests can give you indicators. But you really, if you're worried at all about your health, should get a calcification scan. And the calcification scan will tell you right now how much heart disease you have with great accuracy. And it's a simple $100 scan, most places in the States, 5 minutes. And you can see here on the left, Dr. Gerber's scan, a 0 at 54, which is excellent. And no calcium in the coronary arteries. Calcium only arises in diseased vessels. If you have no calcium, it doesn't mean you have zero disease, but you have such a low amount compared to other people that you've got a great outlook. And the guy on the right, you can see the clear white in his arteries. He's a high-risk patient, even if his bloods looked okay. And one paper I'll show, all of them say the same thing in the human studies. Middle-aged people, a 0 score meant 1.4% events, heart events in the following 10 years, which is really good for middle-aged people, because you're never going to have 0 risk, right? That's silly.
Right.
You've got a 1 to 100 or 101 to 400 score, which is up to the medium or higher. You could have 10 times the risk of a heart event in the next 10 years compared to a 0. And a high score like David Bobbitt, my sponsor, you could have 25 times the risk if you have a very high score of a 0 scoring person. So these risk multipliers based on the calcium scan will really tell you, based on seeing the disease in your body and how bad you really are, what your outlook is. But the crucial message is, if you have a high score, it just means you need to do all the measures to fix the root causes, including medications maybe, and a couple of years later you can check with another scan and verify that the calcification has slowed down. And if it does, we have good evidence to show that your risk plummets once you stop the calcification growing over time. Your risk plummets. down towards a low scoring person. So it's not like you find out you have a high score, oh my God. You find out you have a high score and you go, uh-oh, I'm going to have to fix this. And that's what we want for the people in the world. Wake them up, let them know, and let them take action.
And it is fixable, though. That's what a
Yeah,
lot of people don't realize.
that is crucial, Andrew. So William Davis Wheatbelly is the only published scientist who has shown actual reversal of calcification, and he's also shown flattening off the progression so it stops progressing, which orthodox medicine says cannot happen.
It's impossible, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but he's done it in a whole range of patients in published papers, and we are now hearing all over the world the anecdotes coming in from people who have learned about calcification a few years ago, had a highish score, and have now got it stabilized and not increased, or even we have reversals coming in because they're doing low carb keto, no vegetable oil, no sugar, no refined carbs. They're taking magnesium, potassium, K2, and they're learning from people like you, Andrew, or me, or many others. They're learning the list of key things that can actually slow down and stop the progression of atherosclerosis. And they are not what the orthodoxy told us. They are not vegetable oils and a low-fat diet. Quite the
Yeah.
opposite.
So on just in general, all of the things that you spoke about, all of the layers can be at least some of the damages, or at least some of the future damage can be mitigated by low carb diets. Is that a general statement that's about right?
I would say that is, and I only qualify it by saying it's not, there's many causes and many problems that drive the issue. So a low carb diet is great, but it's not like a magic fix. For me, it's just a no-brainer to go to a lower carb, lower refined carb diet. And especially when the majority of your population is diabetic, and diabetes is a heart attack equivalent. It's so high a risk for heart disease that it's the same as having had a prior heart attack or a big family history. So when most of your population is diabetic and diabetes drives most heart attacks, doing a low carb diet it's just the first step. It's just the first thing you do today when you have a high score. And then you start doing all the other things too.
Right. It's a no-brainer. Do you see that it's slowly becoming more acceptable to do it? Although every once in a while, you've got these hit pieces that come out that say keto's dangerous, it's bad for you, yada yada yada.
Yeah, that junk science comes out. That's a natural result. I'm amused by it sometimes. When the orthodoxy has said low fat diets and eat industrial vegetable oils to be healthy for 30 or 40 years, and all the guidelines and all the professionals and experts have said that, when something like low carb keto comes up and don't eat vegetable oils at all, that's obviously saying they were wrong for 40 or 50 years. And that is absolutely unacceptable to everyone who is an authority in nutrition and health, which is all of the big people and all of the authorities and all of the organizations. So to be honest, I, I, I'm not surprised, and if I were them, I would do a lot of science to try and find any data to say that this is wrong. And what they've dug up is two things. They have no real data because they're wrong, and low carb keto is the healthier way to live. So what they use is epidemiology or associational studies, which are weak, don't prove any causality, and they're pretty much worthless. And they also use mechanistic studies, which kind of theorize mechanisms by which low carb or keto might be problematic. So we're seeing this deluge of weak, kind of almost laughable science. But I will hand it to them. That science is getting put out in all the media and on front pages. And low carb science is only getting out in magazines and stuff. So they still have power to try and confuse and obfuscate and mislead everyone to protect their own belief systems and their own histories.
Well, Yeah, there's billions and billions of hundreds of billions of dollars at stake though too, if people quit eating whole wheat, whole grain cereal. And I think I told you, maybe the audience doesn't know, but what turned me on to this whole thing was when I read Wheat Belly, and at the time I had a whole grain healthy food business, and it put me into depression for about a month, and then I shut it down just because I figured out how bad high carbs were for you. And I had unfortunately, hadn't gotten into finding alternatives. And then I picked up the Wheat Belly book, and everything just went 180 for me. And I thought I was eating healthy at the time, and I was probably doing the worst thing I possibly could.
Well, yeah, and I gotta give a shout out there to William Davis, cardiologist, MD, for Wheat Belly and for the work he did. It's amazing. And to be quite honest, yeah, Davis just worked all this out by himself from looking at his patients, and he realized first that LDL had no connection to the degree of arterial disease that his different patients had. And he slowly came to the conclusion that LDL must be a pretty much rubbish risk marker because it doesn't line up with any of my patients and their level of disease. And then he went ahead and he began to interview them all to find out how they ate, to find out what was special about the badly diseased people. And yeah, he discovered the high carb guys and the wheat eaters, bread eaters were the bad guys. And then he researched it. But he's also a massive proponent of calcium scanning, just as I described. And he wrote a book, Track Your Plaque, and he's a huge advocate of actually measuring the disease. And he published the regression papers that I mentioned there. So yeah, he's a smart guy.
Yeah, I didn't know he'd done those. It's kind of great information there. I wanted to get back to the glycocalyx again. I've got
Yeah.
one question on there, and I saw a video that you did that showed basically when you have insulin spikes. And correct me if I'm wrong here, that it basically wipes out the glycocalyx, and then it takes up to 12 hours for them to recover. Is that about then? Am I off on a tangent here?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Now, I got that from Arteris, who are researchers in glycocalyx for over 20 years. Now, I wrote to them to get the actual papers for those striking diagrams,
Hmm.
and I've no reason to doubt them. But they didn't actually write back to me yet, so I'm still digging at them to get the physical papers where the images came from.
Gotcha.
But what I do have in the meantime, though, I have plenty of other papers, and one of the most clear and striking is they did a oral glucose tolerance on a bunch of healthy people, and essentially they monitored the blood in the following hours after taking the glucose, and they measured all the components of glycocalyx that they know go up in the blood when the glycocalyx is damaged.
Hmm.
Basically, all those strands and hair-like strands fall apart,
Right.
and the components that make them up and the proteins and a thing called halurion, they spike in the blood when the glycocalyx is getting smashed. And they basically showed this huge spike following the oral glucose tolerance, and then hours later it subsides. So I'm very happy that it's been demonstrated with glucose and glucose spikes damages the glycocalyx. The only thing is those images that you saw, I'm still
Hmm.
looking for the paper that they came from because I like to have the published science.
So it's fairly good conjecture at this standpoint. It's not it's we don't have anything that has we haven't dotted the I and crossed the T yet, right?
Well, the principle has been kind of dotted and the T crossed in the paper I told you about, where they gave people a glucose drink
Hmm. Right.
and they demonstrated the glycocalyx components jumping up in the blood and the glycocalyx being damaged. But the exact 12 hours and the nature of a high carb meal is not entirely clear. So we could say that if you take a bunch of glucose, then yes, it's demonstrated that the glycocalyx is damaged systemically and it takes many hours to rebuild.
Gotcha. So
And
on
and
the
oh, and just
Go
one
ahead.
other thing, a
Sure.
glucose test, 75 grams, sounds like oh wow, but that's drinking glucose. But most people eating a high carb modern meal are effectively taking a glucose tolerance test.
Right. And then
Yeah.
what's that transfer into, like a pop or some type of common food item so people can get an idea? Do you know?
Well, if you take glucose, it's 75 grams, and let me see, a can of Coca-Cola. Now I know there's fructose and glucose, but just roughly, it is 11 spoons, and a spoon I think is 5 grams.
So that's pretty
So
close.
a can of Coke is 50 grams, and for normal glucose tolerance, you know that drink GLYCOCALYX? Is
Yeah.
that in America?
Yep. I think so.
Yeah.
Yep.
They used to, as a stand-in, just drink, a small bottle of Lucozade, or maybe slightly larger than a small bottle, and that was the 70 grams of glucose, or 75.
Right. So
So
a
if you
glass and a
eat,
half of pop and you're done.
yeah, I
Or
mean, if
soda,
it's
whatever they call it there.
if oh yeah, soft drinks or whatever, but again, that might be half fructose, so it's slightly different. But rough and tough, yeah. If it's a glucose flavored drink, you're talking something like that. And if you eat a few packets of chips, that's nearly all glucose, carbohydrate, and rapidly digested. So you eat a few packets of potato chips, you're going to get 70 grams of glucose into your bloodstream in no time. So it's not hard. And bread, bunch of bread. There you go.
Yeah, geez. Okay, so we've gone over, and you did a great job on explaining the process. What are some simple fixes? And I asked you before we started this what you do, and I always like modeling people because I don't have the time or the intelligence to figure all this stuff out. So you've been diving into this deeply. What is it that you do, if you don't mind my sharing that, as far as what you eat and what you're, what you do, knowing all that you know?
Right. Okay, Andrew. Well, the thing is, none of us are perfect, and sometimes you're stressed, you're busy, and you mightn't always eat ideally. Though I'm being particularly good at 19. I'm following my own advice, and I've lost a bunch more pounds that I'd slid on. So we have kind of 10 rules, and the first 3 rules are no vegetable oils, no refined carbs or sugars. So that's the elimination 3 rules: processed food, refined carb, and vegetable oils. You got to get them out of your diet. And to be honest, if you only did that and ate real food, you'd be a huge way ahead of your compatriots, right? The
Sure.
processed food is filled with vegetable oils and refined carbs and sugars. So processed food generally is a disaster. So you eliminate those in as much as you can and eat real food. Then the fourth is real whole foods, low carb, healthy fats, and reasonable moderate protein. And that's basically just a standard low carb, well formulated diet where you eat lots of healthy, fatty grass fed meats, fish, avocados, and all the healthy fats. And you just eat low carb and you stick to vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, and all nuts and seeds. It's a classic healthy low carb diet. Now you can go keto. I'm in and out of keto, to be quite honest, Andrew. What I do is I do 2 meals a day, sometimes one. So I do quite a lot of IF, or intermittent fasting.
Okay.
And so when you're on a low carb diet, to make it really keto, you don't have to eat more fat. You actually stop doing something. You eat less meals, and then you go in and out of ketosis because of fasting. And the basic low carb diet combined with fasting kind of makes it like a pseudo keto diet. So that's kind of where I operate. I love fasting. I feel Andrew, to be honest, I fast for at least 24 hours before I go on stage in a big event, because it just gives me such mental acuity and clarity, and this this feeling of being alive. I mean, right now it's 6 p.m. Irish time. So the last I ate was yesterday evening around 7. I was a little late eating, and I just love it. So that's the other thing. Fasting mixed with low carb, making it a kind of a keto blend.
Yep.
And
I think that's where the magic happens.
I think so. This is great for me. Dr. Gerber always called it meal skipping rather than IF. Just skip a meal, feel your ghrelin hormone, feel a little hollowness in your stomach, and feel alive. But you can only do that fasting successfully if you've already been on a low carb diet for a while. So the killer is that high carb diet people, You know, trying to fast, they're just going to feel like crap. You need to be fat adapted. So that's important. And then we have the S's: sun, stress, sleep. Get healthy sun or UV exposure. Stress is not good. I know it's hard to avoid today. Avoid it as much as you can and get healthy sleep cycles. That's important. And supplements. I don't do much supplements, but I do cod liver oil, magnesium, potassium, and a couple of other things. Really core things for the machine, but I don't take a whole range of supplements. And exercise, I've begun running again, just 3, 4, 5 mile runs, no marathons. And I'm going to take up stress or resistance training again shortly. I've been bad for the last year. So I'm going to do some weights and body lift, like press ups and squats. And you know, these body weight type, resistance type exercise, which is really, really good to build your muscle and to promote great health.
It definitely is. Just so out of a 7-day week, let's see here, and I'm drilling down here. If you, like you said, you can tell me to shut up anytime you want to. But so you go for 24 hours without eating, and then what's your normal? I mean, do you have a 16-hour fasting schedule and you eat during 6 hours, or is it just kind of whatever you feel like doing?
It's closer to 420. Like,
okay, gotcha.
Maybe most days, if I have 2 meals, I'll have a meal sometime around 1 p.m. And then the family, I have 5 children, we have a family meal at 6 p.m. Yeah. So we try and keep that social structure. So I know you should eat earlier in the day, technically, but if you're not diabetic, it won't matter so much. And it's a 6 p.m. big meal. And then I'll either have a breakfast, which is really just eggs and some bacon, or just a load of eggs. Or I'll have a lunch where it's some cheese and meats I like, or an omelette thing. Right. So it's kind of like a lunch or breakfast and an evening meal most days. And some days, maybe 2 or 3 a week, I'll just do the one big meal and almost nothing else but coffee and maybe double cream in it. But I mean, it's very few calories. I wouldn't call it a meal.
Right. Gotcha. And then I guess just 2 more things before you go. So everybody's always talking about macros, and I'm of the belief that if you get 20% of this right, you're going to be 80% ahead of where you were before if you cut out, like you said, the processed pretty much everything, and then cut out sugar and flour and the high-end carbohydrates. Where's your range? And I don't need you to get specific, but where's your range on protein, fat, and carbs? Because I know you're a little bit higher than normal on some of those things, or not normal, but what's out there. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So on the percentages, we say, roughly speaking, 20% of energy carbohydrate is a nominal low carb diet.
Okay.
So around 100 grams a day of healthy carbs, 80 to 100 is kind of nominal low carb. Right. Then if you want to go to a more keto, lower carb diet, which for people with diabetes, persistent weight issues and other things, or therapeutically, they may want to go down to 40 or 50 grams carb, or even down to 20 grams carb to really push ketosis. And that can have advantages for people. But myself and Dr. Gerber don't say, oh, everyone's got to be keto. You know, it's a spectrum. And many people, particularly insulin sensitive, overweight people, they won't really benefit so much extra by going really hardcore keto if they're insulin sensitive already. So to your question, around 80 grams carbs, around 18 to 20% energy is kind of where we'd float.
Oh, and what about the fat and protein?
So protein then nominally around maybe around 25% is probably where we kind of level off. We didn't want to go towards a high protein diet because there's some question marks around it when we wrote the book. But since then, I'm more comfortable with higher protein. But we said 0.6 grams per pound of lean mass, which is what Dr. Eads in Protein Power roughly originally recommended. And I think that's probably adequate for most people. If you're doing more exercise, you can push protein up. But also, you can push protein up at his weight management aspect. So higher protein diets will control appetite better. So again, it's another tool that you can help your appetite control and weight loss by pushing up higher protein. But we kind of stayed conservative on not going super high protein in the general diet we recommended.
Right. So 0.6 for lean body mass. It's yeah, and people always have trouble trying to figure that out, but it's roughly 3/4 of what you weigh if you're a normal American, I think. If you in grams, that's
It's,
so.
oh yeah, what is it in oh God, I have the conversion in the book, yeah.
Yeah. Just read your book. It's in there. People can get your
Yes,
book and
exactly.
read that. So that's great to know. What's funny is that I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but when I was diving into this, there was a book out, Eat Fat and Grow Slim, from Dr. McKenna in the 50s, and then Life Without Bread by Dr. Lutz, and his sweet spot that he found over, I think it was 5 or 10,000 patients, and it's been a while since I read the book, was 72 grams of carbohydrates. And he said he demonstrated over 25 or 30 years that people were much healthier, heart attacks went away, and everything that you and I just discussed. So
Yeah, I think 70, 80 grams is a fine low carb diet, and push lower to chase enhanced benefits or as an enhanced tool if you have certain challenges. And yeah, I think that's a great rule of thumb. And no sugar, refined carbs, seed oils, or processed foods. Eat real food. You do that, you're going to be feeling better in no time.
awesome. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. I know if you've got 5 kids, you're busy with that, plus your work, and we'll do our best to get the word out about what you've got. I think you're one of the top 5 sharpest guys that I follow as far as this, and not that there's not other doctors out there, but the thing I like about it is it's practical. And why don't you tell people what you are? Because I failed to do that on the front end. You're not a medical doctor. You are a
Ah, heavens no.
yeah,
No, I have Dr. Gerber for that, the other
right.
half of the partnership. No, I'm a biochemical engineer originally, and back in 1990, in my first couple of years in corporate work, I became basically a technical problem solver, and I began to lead large teams in complex multifactorial problem solving. So to be honest, my 30 years of corporate experience leading complex problem solving and all the data, statistics, comparative analysis and tools of problem solving and logic and everything else, that just put me in a great position 6 years ago when I began to go into decode all of what we're talking about today. It just was really easy for me,
Yeah,
relatively.
I think that it gave you an insight that I haven't seen before in any of the other books, and nothing against the other guys that are out there, but you've been able to kind of like get to the core issues without having all of the biases or worrying about, who's funding you for a pharmaceutical company or a university or whatever. And you kind of were able to cut directly to the chase and bring some common sense engineering logic to the whole process.
Yeah, well, thanks, Andrew. Well, we live in engineering problem solving by the Pareto principle,
Yeah.
and it's a universal principle. 20% of the many potential causes will result in around 80% of your problem. And the problem with talking about cholesterol is you're not observing the Pareto principle. There's 20% of the causes are really, really important. And if you focus too much on cholesterol or other things, then you're kind of missing the big picture. And I think we talked about that today, and it applies right throughout this whole nutritional field, is not focusing on the big picture. That's really the big things that are going to help the population health going forward into the next few decades. Niche obsessions with certain factors, it doesn't help the population. It helps niche people maybe, or gives you a good business model.
Yeah, well, there's yeah, there is that. So thank you so much for doing this. It's opened up my eyes, and I've been moving towards, like you said, being a little bit looser with the macros and what you can do on it. And so that this has been great information, and hopefully, I know people will get stuff out of this. So, uh, can they? If they get the book, would you suggest that they also give it to their doctor if they have someone that's open for that? Because I don't think Dr. Gerber can take, 20,000 new patients.
Yeah, no, that'd be fantastic. In fact, Gerber always was excited about doing the book with me that we could have it as a great resource for doctors who are new to this, because they will recognize all of the technical terms, you know, and by reading it, their eyes could be opened. And
Mhm.
it's not like we're going to try and re-brainwash them, but just by reading it like you did, a doctor reading this will kind of go, wow, I didn't know that. And like every second page, they're going to say, I didn't realize that. And there's 300 plus references to scientific papers published all throughout the book. So they'll also know, God damn, you know, there's a reference here for everything they're saying. And if we convert the doctors, that's a huge part of moving the world forward in solving the modern epidemics of chronic disease. If the doctors don't understand the big Pareto root causes properly and the nutritional underpinning of this whole epidemic, and they just give out tablets and pills, you know, they're on the front line. We need them. We need those guys.
Yep. So everybody's listening. Buy a copy, give it to your doctor, and you know they'll end up thanking you for it. Probably sooner, maybe later. All
Yeah.
right. Thank you, Ivor. I appreciate it. We'll wrap this up. And anything else you want to say? I'll give you the last word.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Well, I just say Irish Heart Disease Awareness, ihda.ie is who I work on behalf of. And if you Google my name, Ivor Cummins, you'll very quickly hit my YouTube channel and the Fat Emperor site that I run. And indeed, you'll find the Widowmaker movie about the calcium scan. And so that's the last thing I'll say. If you Google Widowmaker space CAC, those two words, you'll hit a viewing of the movie, a very exciting high budget movie to explain all about the calcium scan. So that would be sit back with a glass of your favorite tipple and enjoy that fascinating documentary.
Oh, that's the other thing is, do you enjoy alcohol in your diet?
Oh, I couldn't say.
You can say, okay, good.
Well,
All right.
I actually know, I'll be honest, I do like red wine. I've liked it for a long, long time. You know, an evening meal, sitting down, watching a documentary, glass of wine. But I really don't do beer much anymore, and I never did spirits, and I don't like them. But a couple of glasses of red wine, I do enjoy for sure.
And they fit within the diet too.
Yeah, but alcohol, as always, you know, if anyone has a disposition towards drinking too much alcohol, it can be a dodgy thing. And when you drink quite a bit of alcohol with your food, it takes over in the liver and has to be processed, so your body can't process the food. And it's a bit like taking carb if you have too much alcohol, you know.
Yeah.
So moderation.
Okay. Well, we'll put the links for everything that you just said in the video wherever it ends up. And thank you so much. And I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you, Andrew. Yourself too. Bye now.
Bye.